looking forward to hearing the presentation from tonight's speaker. I recognize this title because I believe it is the same as the title of your winter 2008 OHQ article. Is that right?
It was definitely slightly different.
Slightly different. It's pretty close.
Phoenix is different.
The economic Phoenix part, and the Panic of 1893. Anyway, it's a treat. Even if you've read the article, I'm sure we're going to learn a lot tonight. Greg Gordon is an assistant professor of environmental studies at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington. His book that he's going to be speaking from tonight is available for sale on the back table. It's his third book. One of his earlier books is titled Landscape of Desire, Identity and Nature in Utah's Canyon Country. So we're really excited to have him here. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Greg Gordon.
Thanks. Thanks so much for coming out. This is a really amazing venue, and I wish I was in the audience there sitting in those nice comfy chairs. I was standing up here. But so I'm going to go out on a limb here and maybe suggest that Bee Hammond might be one of those statues that could go statuary hall. And by the end of tonight's talk, you can decide for yourself whether you think that's a good idea. I really appreciate Oregon Historical Society for putting this on. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight came out of the research that I did over in the archives here almost 5 or 6, almost 10 years ago. I hate to say that. And if you haven't had a chance, the archives over at OHS are really an amazing resource. I mean, they were so kind and so helpful in pulling together a lot of things that I wouldn't have found anywhere else. And there was actually, I wouldn't say literally a smoking gun, but one of the key pieces that I really needed, I found over there digging through boxes of old timber records. So, let's see. Where should I start? Let's start with a little background on who this guy is and what he was all about. And then maybe we can move on to the railroads. So, take a show of hands. Before tonight's talk, how many people had ever heard of Bee Hammond? Okay. 4. So that's exactly why this guy is so interesting. Here is someone who almost nobody has heard of, and yet he had a significant role in Oregon's history. Hammond really played an instrumental role in shaping the state's economy, shaping the landscape that we currently see in Oregon. He has a town named after him, not too far from Astoria. And at one point, he was one of the single largest landowners in the entire state of Oregon. And yet, he's largely forgotten. In fact, in his home state in Montana, his name was deliberately erased, literally erased. They had a street named after him, and they actually went through and scraped his name off the sidewalk after renaming the street. So there are places where he's remembered, but where he is remembered, he's largely reviled. Why? Why is someone who's so instrumental in the history of the Pacific Northwest was either forgotten or sort of kicked into the dustbins of history? And did he deserve that? Was he really a ruthless robber baron whose exploits deserve to be forgotten? And we'll take a look and see if we can answer that. So it helps to get an idea of where his worldview came from. And Hammond's worldview was shaped by his upbringing in the backwoods of New Brunswick, Canada. For several hundred years, New Brunswick served as the timber colony for the British Empire. And its economy rested on logging the white pine on both sides of the U.S.-Canada border, with little regard to who owned the land or the federal jurisdiction. And so Hammond actually took this attitude of timber poaching. New Brunswick was known as a timber poaching colony. People just went out and cut whatever trees they wanted to. And Hammond took that attitude to the American West. A few years after he left home to work in the timber camps of Maine, A.B. Hammond and his brother George decided to head west for the gold fields in Montana. Traveling up the Missouri River, they heard reports that the gold had been played out and the best stakes were to be taken. Discouraged, Andrew jumped ship at the Musselshell River to try his hand at being a woodcutter for the steamboat traffic. George continued on to Fort Benton. But Andrew inadvertently found himself embroiled in a complex struggle over natural resources that was unfolding on the northern plains. Cottonwood was the fuel for the steamboats on the Missouri, but the Native Americans also needed cottonwood for shelter and food for their horses. And the disappearance of the cottonwood at the hands of the woodcutters like Hammond triggered a short but intense woodhawk war and set the stage for the rest of Hammond's life. The actors would change from Indians to settlers to the federal government to competitors to conservationists. But the question was always who would control access to the nation's forest. 25 years after he arrived as a woodcutter on the Missouri, A.B. Hammond controlled every major business in western Montana, including the First National Bank, the Waterworks, the Street Railway, the Missoula Gazette, the Florence Hotel, the Real Estate Association, the Bitterroot Railroad, and the area's only flour mill. Hammond's Big Blackfoot Milling Company dominated the region's lumber industry. And here, at the corner of Front and Higgins, was a center of power and money in western Montana in 1890. Underpinning it all was Hammond's Missoula Mercantile Company. It was the largest wholesale retail business between St. Paul and Portland, and it was western Montana's largest employer. It was essentially the super Walmart of its day. The Merc, interestingly enough, ended up financing much of Hammond's West Coast enterprises. His railroads, his lumber companies in California were all financed through the Missoula Mercantile Company. So, if you lived in Missoula, Montana in 1890, you likely worked for one of Hammond's enterprises. You bought your groceries, your dry goods, your hardware, your farm implements, your wagons, your perfume from the Merc. If you wanted water or electricity, you got it from Hammond. If you wanted to build a house, you bought your lumber from Hammond. If you wanted to buy a house, you got your loan from Hammond. If you were a farmer in the Bitterroot, you sent your wheat to his flour mill and then sold it to the Merc. And if you wanted a government job, you went to Hammond, who, like Tammany Hall, dispensed patronage through his politicians. And then when you died, you were buried in his cemetery. So how did he go from being a woodcutter on the Missouri River to Missoula's premier businessman? A few years after he arrived in Missoula, Hammond took a job as a sales clerk, and when they became a partner in the Eddie Hammond and Company. Then in 1883, for reasons that are still very mysterious, how did a grocery store get a lumber contract? The Northern Pacific Railroad granted the mercantile firm of Eddie Hammond and Company an exclusive contract, which they never did. They always put their contracts up for bid. They gave them an exclusive contract to supply all the construction lumber from eastern Montana and Miles City clear to the Idaho border. The massive timber requirements included 3,000 cross ties for every mile, plus all the lumber for tunnels, trestles, and bridges. To gain access to the timber cutting rights, the Northern Pacific Grantland, Hammond and his partners incorporated the Montana Improvement Company, which soon got in trouble for cutting timber on public land and began Hammond's descent into infamy. Hammond's MIC, the Improvement Company, derived their legal right to harvest timber from the railroad grant, which enabled them to cut timber from adjacent public lands. While this applied to only the construction of the railroad, Hammond continued to cut timber long after the line was completed. Furthermore, they interpreted adjacent rather loosely, cutting timber from several hundred miles away. The government objected to these practices, as well as the Improvement Company's commercial use of public timber that was supposed to be used for railroad construction. The Montana Improvement Company also patrolled the forests, and they threatened to cut anybody trespassing to prison. The company viewed the forest as its own private asset under its control and ownership, even if it was federal forest. Upon a litany of citizen complaints, the Grover Cleveland administration filed 31 indictments against Northern Pacific and the Improvement Company for stealing more than $600,000 of public timber. The U.S. government also charged Hammond with fraudulently acquiring nearly 12,000 acres. But through a series of political shenanigans, Hammond managed to get the case suspended for 30 years. But then, at the height of the power, came the Panic of 1893. This was the biggest economic collapse in U.S. history until the Great Depression. The causes of the collapse were complex, but not surprisingly, involved speculation, overextended finances, resulted in a rash of bank and business failures, personal, corporate bankruptcies, and massive unemployment. The Panic of 1893, brought the Gilded Age to a screeching halt. Railroads, were the paragon of 19th century American industry, were especially hard hit. They fell into a free fall, and with their collapse, a new economic order emerged. Through a combination of luck, skill, and fortitude, Hammond, unlike many 19th century businessmen, emerged from the panic in relatively good shape. He quickly saw opportunity in the chaos and jumped at the chance. He was a big fish in a small Montana pond, and he recognized the top industrialists of his age. Collis Huntington, J.J. Hill, Jay Gould, Henry Villard had all made their fortunes off of railroads, and he saw his chance to enter the big league with a pair of bankrupt railroads on the Oregon coast. The first of these was the Oregon Pacific Railroad. Now, the names of these railroads keep changing, so just hang with me. It was originally built in the 1870s in a fit of over-optimistic boosterism. The Oregon and Pacific was supposed to be Oregon's first transcontinental connection. It was going to link Yaquina Bay near Newport with Boise, Idaho, cutting 225 miles off the trip from San Francisco, slicing through the Cascades. Bypassing Portland, it would also siphon traffic from the Willamette Valley. Boosters claimed that Newport would be Oregon's metropolis. With the railroad bonded for $15 million, T. Edgerton Hogg sank $5 million into building the line through Corvallis, and up the Santiam River. And it stopped when he hit Detroit, Oregon. In 1890, the Oregon Pacific defaulted on its bonds and it fell into disrepair. 4 years later, the sheriff accepted Hammond's unbelievably low bid of $100,000. The 142-mile railroad also included 16 locomotives, 2 tugboats, and 4 steamships. By paying off the debts on the ships and selling them, Hammond and his partners quickly recouped their original investment plus $20,000. Hammond reincorporated the railroad as the Oregon Central and Eastern and capitalized it at $3 million. With no government oversight, many 19th century entrepreneurs built their railroads as speculative ventures, which often led to shoddy construction. Such capitalists were more concerned with selling stocks and bonds based upon hope and promise than transportation based upon wood and steel. The Oregon Central was a case in point. Its poor condition became evident when one of its bridges collapsed, smashed the train, and killed 2 men. Hammond's other railroad was the yet unbuilt Astoria and Columbia River Railroad. As early as 1853, Astoria began agitating for a railroad, but not until the coming of the transcontinental line 30 years later did Astoria seem assured of rail connections. But by the time the Northern Pacific reached Portland, Henry Villard had overextended the railroad's finances, and he stopped 58 miles short. Hoping to spur someone to finish the job, Astoria formed a railroad company and offered a cash bonus. They heaped subsidy upon subsidy, offering 1,000 acres of prime real estate plus $300,000 to anyone who would complete the railroad line. The new company formed, graded 17 miles, and then they disappeared. Astorians responded by making the subsidy even larger, advertising across the country for investors. 5 more attempts were made between 1892 and 1894, and all failed to secure enough capital to complete the job. Desperate, Astoria increased the subsidy of 4,500 acres of real estate with an estimated value of $1.8 million. Stopping in Astoria on his way to examine the Oregon Central, Hammond took the bait, and he journeyed to New York to secure financing. Despite what he told the Astorians, he had no intention of putting up any of his own money. He thought he could use the subsidy to entice Eastern capitalists. He soon discovered that this was the worst time one could come to New York with a railroad proposition. At the last minute, Hammond finally listed two of the nation's biggest railroad magnates, C.P. Huntington and Thomas Hubbard, both directors of the Southern Pacific, as their financial backers. Although Huntington owned 70% of the ANCR stock, he granted Hammond free rein. Hammond, in turn, idolized a railroad pioneer. And this was the beginning of a long and fruitful relationship between the Hamilton and Huntington families, as well as between Hammond and the Southern Pacific Railroad. Hammond returned to Oregon in April, and now armed with substantial financial backing, he began to bargain from a position of power. Hammond had this propensity to renegotiating contracts that were already in writing. He liked to sort of keep bumping his stake up. He did this over and over again, and he came back to Astoria and he said he wanted additional real estate subsidy, an agreement from the town to cover his expenses worth $6,000, remittance of back taxes, and a lower purchase option from the railroad that already existed from Astoria to Seaside, which they granted him. With the new contract, Hammond wanted to complete the railroad as soon as he could, threw all his energy into building the Astoria Railroad. By May, Astoria's boosters, though, had neither obtained the right-of-way for the railroad nor turned over the land titles and the subsidy, and typical, Hammond responded by laying off all his engineers. Finally, Astoria acquiesced, and he began rebuilding. Losing no time in cashing in the subsidy, Hammond began platting a city on the other side of the peninsula across Young's Bay from Astoria. He announced he would build a massive bridge across the bay, linking the new city, and then Oregonian believed New Astoria would be the greatest harbor on the Pacific coast north of San Francisco. Railroad construction began in August 1895, and although Astorians were banking on freight traffic, it was the tourist trade from Portland to the coastal resorts that proved to be the mainstay of the line. The ANCR became an immediate hit for Portlanders seeking escape from the summer heat. It enabled them to travel to the coast for only $2 or $3 round trip. Portland families had long journeyed to Seaside for the summer, but instead of taking 2 days by steamer, they could make the journey by railroad now in 4 hours. The ANCR initiated a special weekend service that became known as the Daddy Train. Businessmen could leave Portland on Saturday, spend the weekend with their families on the coast, and return to work on Monday morning. Okay, so this is where things get complicated, so bear with me for a moment. These guys all start fighting with each other, and Portland becomes sort of the pawn in the battle of the railroad giants. The success of the ANCR attracted the attention from railroad magnates James J. Hill and E.H. Harriman. Which one's which? Harriman's over here, and Hill's over here. And then C.P. Huntington is in that corner, and his nephew Henry Huntington's this corner, and Hammond's in the middle up here. Harriman is the president of the Union Pacific, and he thinks that the ANCR is going to be a nice addition to his transcontinental network. But rather than simply buying the railroad in typical robber baron fashion, the idea was to undermine its value, drive it to the brink of bankruptcy, make it worthless, and then buy it. With his ownership of the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company, so there was a steamship company that went from Portland to Astoria that was owned by the Union Pacific. And Harriman was thus poised to undercut Hammond's operation. But unknown to either Harriman or Hill, Hammond had a secret silent partner, which was Huntington, who was the director of both the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. And he could basically fend off any attack. Portland transportation became a pawn in this battle between these railroad giants. Although slower than a train, the steamship competed with the railroad because it was 40% less. So Hammond dropped his rates to match. The steamship responded by cutting its fares. Hammond retaliated, slicing the fare for 2 bits to go from Portland to Astoria. And it became a test of wills and financial resources to see who could last and operate at the biggest loss for the longest time. Passengers loved it. The rate war lasted for 2 years. Harriman also used the freight rates to drive Hammond to the wall. Although the Union Pacific had a standard rate for freight from Portland to the Midwest, Harriman refused to extend this rate to Astoria, and that led to the Astoria lumber mills canceling their log hauling contracts. As a result, Hammond had to suspend the freight service and just use the passenger service. Huntington agreed to extend the common rate point on the Southern Pacific, which was coming up the Willamette Valley, and he reassured Hammond that he would back him in his fight against Harriman until the Columbia River ran toward the mountains instead of toward the sea. That'd be a long time. Except that Huntington died, and the feud ended. After suffering combined losses of $600,000, Hammond and the Oregon Navigation Company agreed to cease the rate war and set standard fares. Having successfully foiled attempts to bankrupt the railroad, Hammond and his investors agreed now would be a good time to sell. So Hammond opened negotiations with both Harriman and Hill at the same time, secretly. And they both discovered what a shrewd and uncompromising haggler he could be. Harriman hinted that since he controlled the transcontinental traffic, Hammond was at his mercy. Refusing to be intimidated, Hammond reminded Harriman of the recent rate war and suggested that Harriman would be wise not to engage in another fight. Hammond insisted on $4 million for the railroad, and Harriman paid no more than $3 million. So with his refusal, the negotiations ended for the time being. Leaving Harriman in December, Hammond began to increase the value of both his Oregon railroads. Hoping to sell them as a package, Hammond made plans to build the ANCR from Seaside all the way south to Newport, where it would join the Corvallis and Eastern, and this would provide access to the timber in the Coast Range. Hammond was at heart a lumberman, not a railroad magnate. And before long, he saw his Oregon railroads as a means to a greater end, accessing the timber resources of the Oregon Coast Range. Adding to the Astoria subsidy, Hammond bought timberlands and parcels that ranged from 40 to 50,000 acres along his railroad lines. When Hammond completed the ANCR in 1896, Oregon had 300 lumber establishments. Clatsop County alone produced 20 million board feet. These figures skyrocketed after Hammond's two railroads opened up their previous inaccessible timberlands. By the turn of the century, Oregon's timber industry was cranking out 550 million board feet, and the boosters believed the state had enough trees to last 600 years. The ANCR did bring prosperity to Astoria. By 1910, the city had grown to 15,000 people, and Hammond's Astoria lumber mills were running day and night, all for export. Astoria also boasted 27 salmon canneries, 11 which belonged to Hammond's Columbia River Packers Association. The Oregon Central was another story, and the profits from this line proved as elusive from Hammond as they had the previous owners. Other than providing a quick access from Albany to the coast, the Oregon Central Eastern dead-ended at Detroit, Oregon on the upper Santiam River. To inflate the worth of the railroad, Hammond engaged in a corporate shell game, standard practice among railroad capitalists. While Hammond sought total control over his company, he also wished to conceal his ownership, possibly because he was still under indictment for timber poaching. Backed by Henry Huntington, Hammond announced that he would pump $10 million into finish the railroad, push it through the Cascades into eastern Oregon, and connect with the Oregon Short Line. Although he had no intention of pouring money into the Corvallis and Eastern, the ploy worked. In 1907, Hammond sold the railroad to Harriman, this time, for $1.4 million, a 14,000% gain on the original investment. For years, Hammond had played Harriman and Hill against each other. Back here, these two guys. As well as announcing expansion plans that would threaten their domination of the Oregon market. Harriman's purchase of the Corvallis and Eastern made the ANCR even more valuable now to Hill if he were to compete with the Union Pacific. A few years earlier, Hammond had offered the Astoria line to Harriman for $4 million. Now, in 1907, he bumped up to $5 million, and this time Hill snatched it up. The sale of these two lines left Oregon with no independent railroads. The concentration of railroad ownership hardly concerned Hammond, as he used the money to further his own attempts at consolidation in the lumber industry. So through purchase and land fraud, Hammond became one of the largest owners of timberland on the West Coast. Only behind the railroads and Weyerhaeuser, he owned one of the largest redwood companies in California. With a secure source of raw materials, well-established production facilities, Hammond's next task was to ship his product to market. With connection to the Southern Pacific Railroad, Hammond developed his network of logging railroads. But it was a shipping line that enabled him to haul lumber from the Pacific Northwest to his massive distribution facility in Los Angeles. Hammond would eventually acquire 72 ships, and the Hammond Navy would be the largest and only non-union lumber shipping line on the West Coast. Where am I? Over here, he came up with this kind of unique way of hauling logs. He partnered with a crusty old sea captain named Hugh Robertson to build these cigar rafts. They take these cradles and essentially fill them full of logs and then make these rafts. Some of them were over 700 feet long. And he was using his the ship up here, the lumber schooner, and the lumber schooner would be loaded with logs, and then the lumber schooner then would tow the raft all the way down the California coast to Los Angeles. Doing this, Hammond had land on one side, on the Oregon side, that he could use ship right to his Astoria mills, but on the Washington side, all of his lands were interspersed with Weyerhaeuser. So instead of he didn't have any mills on the Washington side, so instead the idea was to tow them all down to California where they could be sold for piling. And industrialization had created this huge market for piling all up and down the West Coast, as well as overseas, Australia, Hawaii, South America, because piling needed long trees with little taper, and the Douglas fir of the Pacific Northwest were the only trees that met that requirement. So in shipping these log rafts down the Columbia and out to California was a really cheap way to get the logs to Southern California where they could be distributed. In 1910, one of his rafts broke up off of Point Reyes, and another one broke up off Astoria a couple months later. At $600,000 each, it was a substantial loss to the company. The big issue was the ocean storms had scattered. If you can imagine the amount of logs that are in these things, it scattered the logs all up and down the coast, creating a significant menace to shipping. So in 1912, Congress actually tried to ban ocean rafting. The bill failed, and Hammond continued. He's one of the only timber companies to do this until 1922, saving him thousands of dollars on shipping costs. Reflecting back on his mercantile days in Missoula, Hammond realized the greatest profits were not necessarily in production, but in sales. And he pioneered the fully vertically integrated lumber company. The Hammond Lumber Company assumed construction contracts for projects such as aqueducts, movie sets, and apartment complexes. By World War I, not only was Hammond the largest owner of redwood timberlands, he controlled the majority of distribution and retail outlets in Southern California, which was, of course, booming, and the lumber company posted one record-breaking year after another. Following World War I, a short building boom and rising prices triggered overinvestment and overproduction. New technologies engendered faster and more efficient production, but created even greater debt. So this became a familiar cycle, where lumber companies would go into debt to get more facilities, more new technology, and once they had become so in debt, then they needed to cut more trees. The more trees they cut yielded more production. The more they produced, the lower the prices went, and the lower their profit margin. The lower their profit margin, the more trees they had to cut to make up for their lower profit margin. It became this vicious cycle that continued to spiral down into the 1920s. This industrial forestry process was based upon the technological innovations of the 1890s, and the huge shift from selective logging by bull teams and animal logging to this industrial, steam-powered, required, again, greater capital investment, needed paying off more bonds, which made clear cutting became the most efficient method. Clear cutting, of course, had severe and immediate ecological consequences. Scenes such as this led to the opposition of lumber practicing the decimated forests and watersheds. Opposition came from locals, the National Conservation Movement, and government reformers, and progressives such as Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot. Hammond would spend the last 30 years of his life battling these progressives, not only over conservation, but also over business consolidation and labor practices. While the nation enjoyed unparalleled prosperity during the 1920s, the lumber industry began its long, slow decline. Hammond noticed the signs of impending trouble. It also saw opportunity in the depression that hit the lumber industry and advanced the rest of the economy. Even after the stock market fell in 1929, the Hammond Lumber Company was still operating in the black, and a year later, Hammond negotiated a merger, creating the world's largest redwood lumber company. The merger combined 3,500 employees and $42 million in assets. But then, in 1933, at the height of the Depression, disaster struck. On a hot afternoon, August 14th, with a dry wind blowing from the east, fire watchers in the Tillamook forest called a halt to logging. Anxious to get another load in, one crew kept working. As they dragged in the log, the sparks and the friction ignited a nearby slash pile. Fire spread quickly to the down timber and into the forest crown. Despite heroic efforts of 2,000 firefighters, 10 days later, a gusting east wind exploded the fire, the conflagration that darkened the sky and rained ash across the region, and even on decks of ships 500 miles away. The mushroom cloud of smoke towered 34,000 feet high. Winds generated by the fire reached hurricane force and yanked 250-foot trees out of the ground and tossed them aside like they were toothpicks. In just 3 weeks, the fire incinerated 380 square miles of Oregon's Tillamook forest before the rains finally put it out. Of the 10 major timber owners in the Tillamook, the Hammond Lumber Company suffered the greatest loss. The loss compelled the Hammond Lumber Company to close its Garibaldi mill indefinitely. The next year, Hammond died at 85. A story quickly circulated among the lumbermen of San Francisco. According to legend, Hammond, with a shock of white hair, neatly trimmed goatee, impeccably dressed, just as he was in life, sat up in his coffin at the approach of the pallbearers. 6 pallbearers, he thundered, fire 2 and cut the wages of the others by 10%. Was it worth it? On one hand, Hammond and the industrialists were largely responsible for the economic development of the American West. Like many businessmen, Hammond firmly believed in Adam Smith's contention that the pursuit of private wealth resulted in public gain. Others, workers in particular, regarded this as an ideology of expedience. The rapacious pursuit of wealth came from the exploitation of both people and nature. The timber industry in particular generated substantial profits for a few, but ultimately resulted in a collapsed economy and a severely damaged ecosystem. So to return to our original question of why Hammond was so largely forgotten or reviled, I'm not sure. I'll open it up if anybody has any ideas. Thanks. So I think we have a few minutes for. Well, I think there we go. A few minutes for questions. If anybody has any.
Yeah, in the Lower Columbia, was Simon Benson a contemporary competitor to him?
Yeah, Hammond and Robertson. Sorry. So on the Columbia, the rafts were also known as Benson rafts. Simon Benson had a competing rafting operation. Hammond and Hugh Robertson preceded Simon Benson by about 8 years. But Benson also did it, and he was a contemporary lumberman. They actually lived across the street from each other in San Francisco.
And didn't Benson have a lumber mill in L.A. too?
Did Benson have a lumber mill in it? I don't know. He very well may have. Oh, in the archives? what was the smoking gun I found in the archives? What I was looking for was evidence that there was a lot going on with the Oregon land frauds in the turn of the century, especially around 1896 to 1900, when timber companies were just going out and basically doing whatever they could to get land. They were engaging in massive frauds. The Oregon land fraud ring, actually the indictment that came down in about 1912, roped in more people were under indictment than from that basically than any other investigation in the Progressive era. So like Teapot Dome, all the other scandals. This went out shining all in terms of the amount of people that were indicted. It brought down Oregon's 2 senators. The representative was indicted, and a number of judges. So it was a very famous sort of incident in Oregon history of this land fraud trial. And I wanted Hammond to be a part of that. And I did find one slip of evidence. It was a timber record that the guy who ran the Hammond Lumber Company here in Portland, George McLeod, had basically signed off and purchased all these land claims for nothing. And so it was sort of this one little piece I found buried under there, and that sort of tied Hammond to the Oregon land frauds process. And so I suspected that he was part of it, but there was actually a piece of evidence that sort of linked him directly to it.
I was wondering what you knew about the relative size of the Hammond, or importance of the mill, Hammond's mill in Astoria, to his other mills, and also like how important was it? Was it secondary, primary, whatever? And also if you know anything about some of his international ties or labor hiring. I had read somewhere that he actually recruited actively overseas, including India, to bring laborers.
So the question was, how important was Hammond's Astoria mill in comparison to his other mills, and what was his labor hiring practices in Astoria? The Tongue Point mill was significant for Astoria. It wasn't necessarily so significant for Hammond's operations. Around 1900, he purchased a big timber company in Eureka, the John Vance Timber Company. It was the largest redwood timber company. And he sort of moved his operation there. He still had a number of operations. He had a mill in Mill City, up by Detroit, and then 2 mills in Astoria. And the Astoria mill burned down, I think, in 26, and he never rebuilt it. And he had the Garibaldi mill. So he had an Oregon operation, but really his main focus was the redwoods. So that was sort of the amount of money he could generate by cutting down redwoods far exceeded that you could get from Douglas fir. So that's really where he focused. But you're right, he did have some interesting labor practices. He was notoriously anti-union timber barons as a group were anti-union, and Hammond was the most extreme of those. And in fact, when they actually agreed to unionize or allow unionization to take place before World War I, and Hammond held out and sort of was the lone holdout, refusing to go along with that. And yes, he imported workers from India to work in the Astoria mills, and by that point, Astoria had a pretty significant Norwegian population, and when coming into Astoria to build the railroad, he was sort of the hero of Astoria, and within 4 or 5 years, he was sort of the villain of Astoria because of those labor practices.
What happened to Hammond's enterprises after his death?
After his death?
Yeah.
What happened to Hammond's enterprises after his death? The Hammond Lumber Company continued. Hammond died in 1934, and then the Hammond Lumber Company continued under George McLeod, who was the who ran the Oregon operation. He moved down to California, became president of the Hammond Lumber Company, and then in 1956, the owners decided to sell it, and they sold it to Georgia Pacific. So this sort of where Georgia Pacific really entered the West Coast. The purchase of Booth Kelly Lumber Company and Hammond Lumber Company sort of catapulted them into the West Coast. And then eventually they had to spin off Hammond's operations became Louisiana Pacific, essentially.
Did he have family or children?
Yeah, he had five. Did he have children? He had 5 kids, 2 sons, 3 daughters. Both sons died fairly young, and the daughters then sort of gradually sold off different pieces, and then one daughter ended up with she ended up with the fortune from the Hammond Lumber Company, and then she married the heir to Wells Fargo, so she did okay.
He retained his Montana enterprises?
Did he what?
Retain all of his Montana enterprises as well?
Yeah, he wanted to sell them off, but couldn't. And so he actually found that the lumber companies couldn't get financing in New York because they were notoriously went bankrupt. They were very poor investment risk, and so he used the Merc anytime he needed money, needed a short-term loan. He would go to New York and use the Merc as sort of his financing operation. So you could say, well, look, I have the Merc here. This is what I'm borrowing money for. I'm not borrowing money from my timber company. And then you take that money and plow it to the timber company. But yeah, the Merc stayed around until, I want to say, 64.
Were you going to talk about the Panic of 1893 and how it affected Oregon?
How the Panic of 1893 affected Oregon. I didn't focus too much on that. Hammond was still in Montana in 1893, and his bank was the only one in the state that survived the panic. He was able to actually keep it open where all the other banks were shutting their doors, but I don't exactly know the details of the Panic of 1893, how it affected Oregon particularly.
Speaking of 1893 panic and the photos that you had up about that, the lower, my right one was a train tip. What was the story behind that photo?
I was just looking for a photo of a train that collapsed.
But what does that mean? I mean, why is it collapsed?
I think that one just ran off the tracks. I was just trying to portray, a train that had just, because the whole railroad industry just collapsed. I was just trying to do visual.
Just a metaphor photo. Okay.
You said that the railroad between Portland and Astoria was mainly being used for tourism. After he sold it, did it remain that way, or what's the history of that railroad segment?
Well, yeah. So what was the history of the railroad after Hammond sold it to Hill? Well, he could then connect. Then it became part of the Union Pacific, and so they could. The reason it wasn't shipping freight is because Harriman refused to extend that freight rate. But now that Hill had the Northern Pacific, rather, it became part of his line, so they could all the timber and salmon that were coming out of Astoria could then be shipped on that rail line. So then, because it had the common rate point going all the way to Astoria, then it could be used to ship traffic or freight as well as passenger traffic. Okay, one more.
Yeah, so you started the lecture illustrating Hammond's kind of control over Montana and the entire everything that everyone did. Did he have a similar influence this far north, or did his focus on timber kind of dominate what he did for himself?
Did Hammond's control over western Montana translate to Portland or? He tried, not so much Portland, because Portland was obviously quite a bit bigger and had other interests. He tried to Astoria, and they wanted him to build a flour mill there, and he insisted that if he built a flour mill, they had to buy all their flour from his flour mill. And they said, no, sorry. And then he ran into, sort of the radical, the IWW and the radicalization of the workers in Astoria in the early 20th century, and Astoria actually became sort of a sore point for him. He could never really put the stranglehold on that he wanted to, and so I think he's kind of, once the Tongue Point Mill burned in 26, he kind of walked away from Astoria.
Did he ever live in Portland?
Yes. Did he ever live in Portland? He lived in Portland for 2 years. Again, after he sold, he sold his lumber mill in Montana, the Anaconda Mining Company, and his intention was to come to Astoria and start, work on the railroads, become a big railroad businessman, and then build this lumber industry. And then in 1900, he just got this great deal on a redwood lumber company. And so after spending 2 years in Astoria, he then moved to San Francisco. At that time, all the lumber guys were moving to San Francisco. That was sort of the financial headquarters. And so anybody was living on Pacific Heights in San Francisco. All right, well, thanks a lot. I'll be happy to answer any other questions that people might have. And have a nice evening.